Hey Unwrappers, Olly here. Just before we commence this week's proceedings, an opportunity to remind you, if you enjoy this show, you would likely also enjoy it in paper form. The Week magazine, delivered to your door each week, includes a selection of news, reviews and opinions from more than 200 UK and international sources for open-minded readers. And we've got a special offer for you podders. To get 6 free issues and a free Moleskine notebook, go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD25. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD25. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 19th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. Over the past 7 days, we've seen the rationing of coronavirus tests in the UK, Barbados announcing plans to remove the Queen as head of state, and a new console war as Sony unveils the PlayStation 5 to compete with Microsoft's new Xbox. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's Gabriel Power and the boss man, Holden Frith, and from the Week Junior, editor Felicity Capon. It's an all-star trio this week. Felicity, you are starting, though. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we found out that creating a level playing field is actually a slippery slope?
I think, of course, I felt that from the day one, from the beginning. Obviously, the day I was questioned if I'm a woman or I'm a man. Obviously, that's, to me, is a violation. For me, it's a disgrace. It's an insult, which is one thing for me, for sure. I can never be something I'm not.
Olympic and world champion athlete Caster Semenya speaking to ENCA. Now, Felicity, many of us will have seen the World Athletics ruling against her last week. That's the organisation formerly known as the IAAF. But for the benefit of those of us who didn't, first tell us what happened there, and then tell us why you think it still has resonance this week.
Yeah, so this is the ongoing case of Caster Semenya, who is the South African double Olympic champion over 800 metres. And her case has been going on for over a decade now, has reached a critical point. Last week, a ruling by the Swiss Federal Tribunal upheld an early decision by the Court of Arbitration for Sport that women with male levels of testosterone must take a hormone suppressant if they want to compete. It's actually a little bit trickier than that, and I'm indebted to a very good podcast, which I would recommend alongside this one, called the Real Sport of Science podcast with Dr. Ross Tucker, who is much more of an expert on this than I am. But basically, this decision establishes that athletes with something called hyperandrogenism, which is athletes with higher levels of male hormones like testosterone and known as difference of sex development, must lower their testosterone in order to compete. It's not just any hyperandrogenism, though. It covers athletes that are biologically 46XY with testes, which is what leads them to have high testosterone levels. So a genetically male pattern.
And that's the case with Caster Semenya, isn't it? She was born with undescended testes, right? So she was brought up as a woman, but actually, had she been an athlete, if you like, as a baby, which is ridiculous, but had she, at that point, if they'd tested testosterone levels, she'd have been considered genetically male.
I think it gets very murky, and I'm not sure anyone quite knows for sure. Obviously, she was assigned female at birth, so presumably she has a vagina, but it seems accepted that she is intersex. It seems that she would have both male and female reproductive organs to some degree. But regardless of this, she does have higher testosterone levels, and some people have argued for a long time that gives her an unfair advantage. The reason why this policy has come into force is to keep men's and women's sports separated, because scientists believe that testosterone supplies huge advantages.
So what is the underreported bit? Why are we still talking about it this week?
It's obviously generated a lot of comment pieces and a lot of opinions. Some people are focusing on her race. There are allegations of racism and that this is to do with her being black and the sort of fighting ground over black bodies. But I think what's so important about this is the fact that it's coming back down to these actually very scientific, very technical arguments and decisions about how testosterone impacts athletes.
Okay, and what have we learnt about that, Holden?
I think we've learned that there's a bit of a mismatch between where the science has got to and where the general conversation has got to. And I think it's been complicated by seeming parallel with the debate about trans people, even though this actually, I think, when you get down to the science of it, has much less to do with it than it might seem at first glance. It's even, as Felicity was mentioning, not directly to do with levels of testosterone. It's a sort of combination of levels of testosterone and the male genetic makeup. So under the current athletic rules, if a woman has elevated levels of testosterone but doesn't have internal testes, then she wouldn't have to take hormone suppressants. She would still be allowed to compete with that level of testosterone. It's a very complex decision taken by a sporting body that's trying to split the difference really between a scientific argument and a social argument, and a desire to preserve women's sport in a way that means it won't be dominated by people who are genetically male.
What is the proof that testosterone provides an advantage to athletes anyway, Felicity? Because suppressing testosterone that she has now wouldn't suppress the testosterone that she had growing up, going through puberty anyway.
I think this is where World Athletics ran into problems, is that they were trying to find proof by looking at elevated rates of testosterone in different disciplines and different sports, but actually they were much more watertight on the principle, and the principle is that testosterone is the driver advantage across all sports, and you only need to look at the fact that there are thousands, and this is just a fact, there are thousands of boys and men who are stronger and faster than the fastest and strongest women competing today. I think that sometimes usually shocks a lot of people, but the advantages of testosterone is that it gives you stronger muscle mass, it gives you higher levels of hemoglobin. There's all sorts of ways that it makes the body stronger. And this is what Ross Tucker in this podcast that I mentioned before was saying, that it's almost ludicrous that the new policy only covers certain events, which are 400 metres to the mile events, which means that technically Semenya could compete in a 200 metres event, for example.
But even if you separate by levels of testosterone, there are different body types that do well in sport. Usain Bolt has longer legs. Michael Phelps has longer arms, Gabe. That isn't discriminated against, that's celebrated.
That's obviously where the debate gets into kind of murky waters, especially considering the fact that one of the studies that the IAAF, the governing body, put forward as part of their evidence for introducing the rule last year about testosterone levels, showed that there's the difference between female athletes with higher testosterone levels and those with more typical levels is about 1 to 3%, which is not very big. And then the difference between women's performances and men's performances in Caster Semenya's fields, like the 800 meters, the 1500 meters, is about 10 to 12%. So it's clearly not just testosterone that makes the difference there. I think the conversation about the difference in bodies, like Michael Phelps' lung capacity and long arms and Usain Bolt's legs and all that, I suppose it's because of the fact that anti-doping laws that the IAAF has in place, like specifically include regulations banning testosterone treatment. And so I suppose in the same way, I don't know, if you have basically what the IAAF considers like a naturally occurring steroid in your system that gives you an unfair advantage, that seems to be where they have chosen to draw the line.
I think the other issue is that if you have men's and women's sport in separate categories, you have already created a dividing line. In the same way, perhaps, that we have different categories for boxers. So if you're over a certain weight, then you compete against people of that category. So if you're going to keep that distinction between women's sport and men's sport, then you clearly have to have a line, and that's where this ruling comes in.
There's a sort of cold clinical analysis that you can do, Felicity, but on the other hand, we're talking about a human being here, and the choices are then, for her, for Caster Semenya, the choices were we're either forcing her to participate as a man, which is ridiculous, and she's clearly a woman, identifies as a woman, brought up as a woman, etc., or what they've done, which is insist that she takes a hormone suppressant to participate. Both options just feel so out of line with the way you'd want organisations like the Olympic body to be behaving in the 21st century.
I don't think anyone could possibly deny that this case is an absolute tragedy for Semenya, and it really doesn't have any solutions that don't cause huge amounts of pain and anger. Like it really is just such a problematic case. what she can do now, as you said, her options are limited. So firstly, she would need to find a doctor who would be willing to give her drugs to lower testosterone. And ethically, this is really dodgy. And actually, there have been medical bodies of doctors who say they just won't do it because she doesn't want it. So a third party is willing this doctor to give someone drugs which could have all sorts of horrendous side effects. So for example, her performance will massively deteriorate by about 5%, which means she would now just about scrape into finals. Her muscle mass will go down, hemoglobin levels will drop, she'll have more body fat, she'll just be slower. There would be health consequences, like it could trigger the menopause. So major lifestyle risks and changes. As we said before, she could try the 200-meter race, but the kind of cruel thing about this ruling is that the ruling says that this is a living document, so therefore in future they could decide to could restrict her from running that too. She could take it to the European Court of Human Rights, but that would be costly, it would be a very long process. So it could be that she's got skills and talents outside of the world of sport, she's a businesswoman, so it might be that she hangs up her running shoes and says, that's it, I'm out of here. And I think one thing to say about that would be really sad, because if she can't compete against men, she can't compete against women, we would lose her, we would lose that visibility from the world of athletics. And if you're growing up as an intersex girl, you're going to lose this woman who is, whatever you think about her, an absolute trailblazer.
Yeah, I just feel that the ruling seems so arbitrary. That's the problem with it. If they had also included the 200 meters and other events in it, it may not have come under so much backlash. As Deadspin put it when it first came out, they said, the only point of track's dumb new testosterone rule is to make it illegal to be Caster Semenya. So it does feel like she's being targeted. World Athletics coming out and defending the decision by saying this is a legitimate and proportionate means of protecting the right of all female athletes feels a bit like kicking her when she's down, considering that's not what they've done, in my opinion.
It's, obviously a hot button issue. You can hear us all choosing our words carefully on this one because it is sensitive, Felicity. It goes way beyond the world of sport, doesn't it? What do you think are the repercussions for this? What are the consequences of this story?
I think we'll have to see what happens next. Caster Semenya, the spotlight has always been on her, but like you said, the issues and the battle lines being drawn over gender and sex, and at the moment it's such a emotive and sensitive debate, and this is, like you said, this is one part of a much bigger thing. I think it is going to become the defining issue of our generation, this sort of battle line between sex and gender.
Gabriel, beat that. Your story is up next after this. Okay, Gabriel, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Why is 2020 the year that violence returned to Colombia?
Despite the government assurances to investigate the deaths, most end up unsolved. A commission for security guarantees that was supposed to work to dismantle the criminal organizations behind the killings has met only once.
Al Jazeera's Alessandro Rampietti reporting from Bogota. So, Gabriel, we're talking about Colombia. What's been happening there this week?
So, 4 years on from a historic peace agreement which brought hostilities between Colombia's government and various left-wing paramilitary factions to an all-time low, a strange cocktail of events has led to a dramatic resurgence in violence across the country in 2020, with, depending on the source, upwards of 30, 40, 50 massacres of 3 or more people having taken place so far just this year alone.
That's the UN definition of a massacre, isn't it? It's a shocking word. It's a shocking event. But it isn't anything new in Colombia. Massacres is how things used to operate there.
Yes, that is the UN definition. It's also the definition of Human Rights Watch. And the definition, in fact, is quite an important part of the story that we'll come to later. But that's the key, is that it was how Colombia operated. It's difficult to know where to start with this current spate of killings, but the historical context is key. Obviously, for decades, starting in the 1960s, massacres were a routine part of life in Colombia as a result of an armed conflict between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which most people will know as FARC. Mm-hmm. And this, for the most part, was brought to an end by a pretty astonishing peace agreement that was very hard won between the two sides, ending the war that had left thousands of people dead and probably millions displaced, and even earned the then President Juan Miguel Santos a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, so that was in 2016. What's gone wrong?
Well, FARC hasn't officially reformed, but a separate armed conflict has now broken out between dissident revolutionary groups who were once part of FARC but didn't agree to the peace deal, and the Popular Liberation Army, known as the EPL, the National Liberation Army, known as ELN, and a powerful drug cartel known as the Clan del Golfo. And these four groups are understood to be vying for control over drug trafficking routes and illicit crops in remote regions of the country where police presence is slim. And that is where most outside observers believe that things have gone wrong. It's that the government failed to enact strict security measures that were sufficient to avoid a power vacuum forming in those regions after the peace deal.
And that reference to the drug trade, Felicity, is never far away when it comes to Colombia, both the substance of cocaine and the political implications of it. You can have a peace treaty, but if you haven't dealt with the drugs war, there's going to be a drugs war.
I think it's a huge part of it. And I think some people are accusing the government of just making excuses. But actually, when you look at this, it's very mountainous regions in Colombia filled with this kind of lucrative cocaine crop. There's huge demand for this drug from the US, from the UK. The cocaine trade is still huge. It always makes me think, especially of like cocaine use in this country fueling all this absolute misery and violence in places like Colombia. It's also the fact that people are saying excuses and saying that's not good enough. And with the president at the moment, Ivan Duque, he had promised that cocoa farmers would be able to join substitution programs that would help shift them from cocoa to legal crops. And this was going to be one of the ways to wean some of these impoverished people, these farmers, off from cocaine. But actually it's been limited to a very small number of families that have been included in the program, and it needs to be obviously far more widely implemented if it's going to work. So that's just one of the criticisms of the government. It's just not doing enough. It could be doing more.
Yeah, and Duque, Holden, the current president of Colombia, whose Conservative Party was hugely opposed to the peace deal in 2016, how much of the blame can we lay at his door?
It's such a murky situation that I think it's quite difficult to decide exactly where the balance of blame lies. He's certainly getting a lot of the blame, and he doesn't seem to be doing much to try to reduce the divisions within Colombian society that have always really been under the surface, but seem to have come more to the fore actually since that peace deal. I think partly because, just as on the rebel side, their cause was uniting them, and since they've mostly laid down arms, that's led to a fracturing in much the same way that we saw in Northern Ireland. In fact, in Colombia, also on the government side and amongst civil society in general, there seems to be much more willingness to criticise the government and much less unity within the government now that they no longer have FARC as a common enemy.
Gabriel, there's also another group, the AUC, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. They're a right-wing militia accused of horrible war crimes, dissolved in the mid-2000s. They could be back as well.
So yeah, in a recent interview, the leader of the ELN, which was one of the left-wing militias that is quite similar to FARC in a way, he blamed the violence on a resurgence in crime related to former AUC members because of the the house arrest of former Colombian President Alvaro Uribe, who was a hugely controversial figure that as of this year is under investigation for war crimes, such as the ones you mentioned. There was a big one in the late 90s. And so a lot of people think that his house arrest has galvanized their cause and made them take up arms again. Also, Duque is considered a bit of a kind of disciple of Uribe, and so he's been blamed by the left-wing militias of stoking the rhetoric that might cause right-wing militias to take up arms.
He was always a skeptic of the peace deal in the first place, wasn't he, Duque? Which kind of makes me suspicious. He has opposed offering generous benefits to violent groups in order to get them to disarm, which was what his predecessor Santos did with FARC to bring about the peace deal. But on the other hand, he hasn't led any sort of huge military offensive against such groups. So he's not really doing either of what his predecessors have done to try and tackle the situation.
And actually, Gabe, the government is playing it down, aren't they? Or like actively deploying smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, Duque is taking a very weird stance against this whole thing. Basically, what's happening is a lot of the time when these paramilitary groups and drug cartels go into towns, they are committing massacres. They're like slightly ISIS-inspired massacres, where it's not like they'll just assassinate one person who has political connections. They'll go into a party and they'll gun down 8 teenagers. They are behaving quite a lot like kind of terrorist organizations. And so it's undeniable that they are massacres, and you can define them as such using the UN's definition. But Duque keeps using the rather weird alternative term of collective homicide. And that's seen as many people as him attempting to downplay it, he also is frequently on Twitter posting graphs that show that, oh, my regime actually isn't as violent as the last one. He's quite Trumpian in that way.
So it sounds like a situation, Holden, that's going to get worse rather than better.
It does, and as with everything else at the moment, part of the reason for that is also coronavirus, and the pandemic has hit Colombia pretty hard. They've had the combination of quite a strict and a long lockdown, but also high levels of infection and deaths, and so that has really given them a worst case scenario in terms of the economic hit, but also the sort of social divisions that forcing families to stay apart has created, and that generates really the ideal conditions for armed groups to try and recruit people, particularly young people. And the group Open Democracy has said there's a very large number of new recruits to these militia are very young people, often children, in fact, who are then used for picking coca leaves or couriering drugs around, and they then tend to be, indoctrinated and turned into more active militia roles later on.
And when we use the word recruits, Felicity, obviously that sort of suggests an element of volunteering to people listening in the West. But obviously, if you're from around there and you're a child and you're taken by a militia group and trained up, it's not really an aspect of enrolling yourself, is there?
No, it makes you think really what options are there, really. And that's why it needs a sort of much more imaginative and stronger and more strategic and disciplined strategy from the government, which is so clearly lacking. I think it's also a sad story because I remember writing about this in the Week Junior in 2016 when the peace deal came in, and we were like, oh, this is so great. This is such a nice story to tell our readers about people working together to form peace. And it suddenly makes you incredibly wary of peace deals, and just thinking about this deal brokered by Trump and Kushner with Israel and the UAE, and just thinking, what do these peace deals really actually mean in practice?
You'll be pleased to know we have something of a lighter story coming up next. It's from Holden after this. Okay, Holden, you're finishing the show, and I should warn everyone who is still recovering from Theo's New Guinea singing dog clip a few weeks ago that this is another acoustic shock. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are we dealing with potential killers or just orcas having a whale of a time?
Oh, there's so many whales, and they keep flippering. I like their song. There are 3 of them with a song.
Not, in fact, a hidden track from Sgt. Pepper, but the soothing sounds of whale song, courtesy of National Geographic. Or perhaps an orchestra, Holden. Yeah. What's the story?
I'm still recovering from that, I'm afraid. The story is that since the end of July, but we've only learned about it this week, large numbers of killer whales, or orcas, have been ganging up on boats in the Straits of Gibraltar, and depending on who you believe, either attacking them or just playing with them very roughly and in a non-consensual way.
Now, how can a boat consent? But anyway, what happened?
What happened is, there's been several cases actually. In one of them, there were 9 killer whales who all ganged up on a 46-foot boat, broke off its rudder, ate part of it, disabled its engine, and turned it round 180 degrees. This was obviously quite traumatic for the people on board, and they had to phone the Coast Guard and be towed back into harbour. But there were other cases too. Another yacht came under sustained assault for 50 minutes, was tipped over, righted itself again, but it also ended up turned in the other direction, and one of the crew in that boat was injured trying to get the boat back on course.
Okay, so the whales of Gibraltar are lashing out. That's the story. So the obvious question that we're going to discuss now with all our orca knowledge is why. Holden, do you have any thoughts to kick us off with?
It's been a couple of years now since I referenced The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on this podcast, but this did remind me of Douglas Adams' theory that the dolphins were the most intelligent creatures on Earth, and in fact that they left the Earth moments before it was demolished to make way for an interstellar bypass. I did wonder if the whales are perhaps trying to tell us something rather urgent. Scientists unfortunately have slightly more prosaic theories, although even some of theirs might seem far-fetched. The one thing they're all agreed on is that this is really unusual behaviour. Orcas can be quite playful. They are known to grab hold of boats and use them to propel themselves through the water. But there haven't been very many reports of this sort of sustained attack.
If it is, Felicity, that the orcas have had enough, that they're lashing out on humans because of something humans have done, what will have riled them?
The Gibraltar orcas are endangered. There are fewer than 50 left. And the sort of main battleground for them is between them and fishermen who are going after tuna in the area. And as a result, adults...
That's their lunch, basically.
Pretty much. As a result, adults and juveniles are sustaining injuries. There's food scarcity. There's pollution. It's not a great place for them to live. So you could probably see why. I mean, also, these creatures are very intelligent. You could see why they would not be very happy about this. There was one point that was raised in this article in The Guardian about what could be going on. Someone raised a point that could it be that there was reduced noise and activity during the COVID lockdown, and now that it's coming back and that fishermen are getting out there again, hang on a second, we're not putting up with this. We can more easily identify who is making our lives miserable, and we're going after them.
Right.
The thing that it made me think about this story, I don't know if anyone's seen the documentary Blackfish.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, it's great. It's about
And
orcas.
I love SeaWorld, so I'm torn. But yeah.
Orcas at SeaWorld, and it's really chilling in that you can see quite clearly these orcas. I know this is in captivity, so it's slightly different, but they develop a psychosis where they go a bit mad and really do turn on their human trainers. And there's incredible footage from it of one very experienced diver called Ken Peters, who had a very good relationship with one of the orcas. And at one point during a live show, this orca just turns on Ken Peters, grabs him by the foot, and repeatedly starts very slowly pulling him down very, very deeply for something like a minute 20 each time. So this on the edges of what humans can deal with. And it looks like this whale knows exactly what he's doing, is really toying with this human being in quite a life-threatening situation. They're not stupid, these animals.
The problem that killer whale fans have, Gabe, is that they are an animal like many we discuss on this show who are at threat. And if you're trying to protect an endangered species, even if they have had enough of humans, even if they are capable of attacking humans in ways that we hadn't really understood before, and that's interesting, you don't really want that news to get out there because that's going to damage their image.
Yeah, I suppose that is true. If you look at, obviously, endangered species like, for instance, pandas, people go mad for saving pandas when they are,
Face
in
of the
effect, a
WWF.
species. Yeah, exactly. There are species that can barely survive on their own. We've had to keep them on life support for decades. But yeah, no, I think the fact that there's scientific evidence to suggest that orcas can be affected by stress and noise pollution and chemicals in the water, I think, if anything, that might endear them to people. I feel like, yeah, like there was a big news story, I remember last year, that there was a group of orcas in Puget Sound up in the Pacific Northwest of America, and they, because of what was thought to be a mixture of noise pollution causing stress and chemicals from shipping, every calf that was born from 2015 to 2019 died. Every single one, which indicates that there's some sort of element or some combination of these elements is causing problems with fertility. Whether or not that's happening to the Gibraltar orcas, we don't know. But then one was finally born, a baby in 2019, and that made big news, and everybody was quite cheerful and happy about it. So I don't know.
What a sweet man you are, Gabriel. I mean, Holden, I've seen Jaws. I know what happens. If these attacks continue and one is actually fatal, then the Gibraltarians are not going to be that keen on fishing.
Yeah, fishing and tourism, and there's a lot of economic activity tied up in the waters around the Straits of Gibraltar, and I think people are really fickle about their attitude to wildlife. And I think in a lot of the reporting about these incidents, there's a real desire amongst the scientists who study them to talk up their human characteristics, really, in a way that sometimes almost feels implausible. There's a neuroscientist called Laurie Marino who told The Observer that whales have the wherewithal and the cognitive capacity to intentionally strike out at someone, to be angry and to really know what they are doing, which that suggests human levels of processing of not just a reflexive defense of territory, but a kind of burning desire for revenge. But other scientists have gone even further. In the Atlantic magazine a couple of years ago, scientists from the Centre of Whale Research said he'd seen whales watching trawlers hauling fish out of the sea, and that he believed they had connected that kind of activity with the shortage of food in their own environments. And you connect those two things together, and it does imply that the whales are sitting thinking about us and wondering how they're going to take back their territory.
You can sympathise, can't you, Felicity, what you were saying about the lockdown, if that is a cause, because I think many of us would identify with that in terms of the skies. You look up and there are fewer aeroplanes and it seems much more pleasant than it used to. The sky is bluer, the sun is clearer. And then when the planes come back, because I understand what they are and they represent the economy and my opportunity to leave the country, I'm a bit forgiving. But if I didn't know what an aeroplane was, I would think that's the problem. Look, it's back again.
So are you comparing us with whales and the boats to whales are what the aeroplanes are to us?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it. I agree. It's a great analogy. I love it. It was funny, wasn't it? It was one of those benefits of lockdown that everyone was saying, oh, it's so nice, and our carbon emissions are going to go down and we're going to give the planet a chance to recover, and isn't that lovely? And actually, I feel like it's all coming back. And yeah, I don't find it that hard to believe that they suddenly have more of an understanding of like how their food source is being threatened now. That seems plausible to me.
I should also quickly say, jumping to their defence, that there has never been a fatal orca attack in the wild.
There's been recorded.
Yeah.
So, could we see other animals joining in the revolution, Holden? I don't fancy my chances in a tiger rebellion.
I think that there was an episode of this podcast a while ago where I may even have proposed the idea of reintroducing lions to England, but I think I would rethink that policy if I thought they were going to mount some sort of concerted attack on the tube.
Well, there are monkeys in Gibraltar. We could be seeing Planet of the Apes in real life.
True, and you don't want to mess with baboons.
You don't. On which bombshell, that is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. A big thank you to Holden, Felicity and Gabe. It's been a whale of a time. If you prefer sinking podcasts to sinking ships, that's actually a good pun. Well done, Sarah. Remember, you can download every episode of our back catalogue right now. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann, the producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Our music is by Tom Morby. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.